Welcome to a panel about pinkwashing. We have some amazing panelists for you here, and it's going to be really great. I'm Shelby.
I'm Nicole.
And we're going to be moderating today. So we just wanted to intro a little bit, and we're going to kind of go down the line and just have our panelists introduce themselves with their names and pronouns, but you'll hear more like fancy details about them later, you know, all the badass stuff they've done, but this is just kind of so you know who's sitting up in front of you. You want to start?
Oh, I'm Wendy Elisha Summerson, and I use they.
Hi everyone, I'm Selma, and I use she and her.
I'm Jenny, and I use they and them.
Alok, they and them.
Awesome. All right, so with that, to get it started, we're first going to have a representative from Super to come up and talk about their work. So yeah, give it up for Super.
Hello, I'm Aaron, and I'm a member of Super, Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights at the University of Washington. And we are a diverse student group made up of students, faculty, and community members around the University of Washington, Seattle, working to educate students in the broader community about the struggle for Palestinian equal rights. I would also like to recognize that as we talk about the occupation in Palestine, that we must acknowledge that the UW is on occupied Duwamish land and indigenous Coast Salish territory. Responding to the Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel, or BDS for short, we support the non-violence of violent methods of BDS until Israel meets the obligation to the Palestinian people and international law by ending its occupation and colonization of Arab lands and dismantling the apartheid wall, recognizing the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinians of Israel to full equality, and respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated by United Nations Resolution number 194. Super UW members understand the struggle for Palestinian equal rights as it intimately entangled in global struggles for economic, social, and cultural justice, including the struggles of other indigenous peoples around the world, such as the Idle No More movement in Canada and the Zapatistas of Mexico, and the structural inequality we face in our own country. We understand that the true definition of solidarity is an honest understanding that our own liberation is tied up in the liberation of others, and that the oppressed must lead the struggle. As Super to UW, we also stand in solidarity with local struggles on the UW campus against racism, sexism, homophobia, and all other forms of oppression and colonization. As an anti-racist organization, Super condemns all forms of hatred and discrimination, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We'd just like to mention as well that yesterday you may have seen some signs out in the quad commemorating with the names of different Palestinian villages that were depopulated before and after the 1948 war between Israel, well, depends how you want to define a war. We're just essentially commemorating the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people from their ancestral homeland and commemorating this historic tragedy, while also commemorating various other injustices such as local indigenous communities in around the Seattle area, and just essentially commemorating this historic event and trying to spread awareness and educate the UW campus about this historic event and why the Palestinian people are still refugees so many years after what happened in '48. And so we just want to tie this to this event, is that as we commemorate the rest of Palestinian refugees, we are also tying all our struggles for justice together. So, as a student organization, we are excited to be co-sponsoring this event with Queers Against Israeli Apartheid Seattle, as we recognize that the same oppressive forces of racism, militarism, patriarchy, and homophobia and imperialism are inherently tied to the oppression of the Palestinian people. We recognize that LGBTQ liberation is inherently tied to the liberation of the Palestinian people, and that one form of oppression does not cancel out the other. We stand tonight in solidarity with all struggles for social justice. I invite you to take a literature to learn more about what we do for Queers Against Israeli Apartheid and Super, and I'd like to thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's panel.
So now we're going to have some folks from Queers Against Israeli Apartheid come up and talk about their work and also define pinkwashing generally for y'all to get the panel started. So give it up for Layla and Shima.
Hello everybody. My name is Shima, and I'm an Iranian activist here, and
I'm Layla, and I'm also with QuAIA, and I'm mixed Palestinian and Irish heritage, and I go by she.
Oh yeah, and she or they. Okay, so we're just going to start off talking to you a little bit about pinkwashing. You should have, I believe you have the definition of that in the pamphlet that was given out to you. But just to briefly talk about it as well, in the context of Israel, pinkwashing basically refers to Israeli efforts to present itself as this harmless state that is very diverse and this very modern and relevant place that has a lot of like amazing things and it's fun, and it's basically a way to sort of co-opt the movement for LGBT rights for their own PR purposes. And that is set as opposed to, for example, Palestinians or Arabs in general who are backward or they're homophobes, etc. So you have this sort of dichotomy that is created, and this is all, as we'll explain a little bit more, as part of their PR campaign to sort of pinkwash their crimes against the Palestinian people.
Just to clarify, the backward and homophobic, yes, there's stuff that exists in Palestinian society, but Shima's referring to the PR campaign painting Palestinian society as extremely that way, and exclusively that way, in contrast to Israel as a Western haven for everybody.
Right. So, so just to give you a few examples of pinkwashing that we have noticed, there was this campaign started by Pamela Geller, who is this right-wing conservative, loves Atlas Shrugged person, and the American Freedom. It's true. That's her website. It's Atlas Shrugged. And the American Freedom Defense Initiative, which is also another conservative organization here in the United States, and they basically placed these bus ads in San Francisco, and also later on went to metros in New York, which said, like, in a war between the civilized man and the savage, always defend the civilized man. And then it said, defend Israel, defeat jihad. So that's like sort of the rhetoric that they're using, is trying to build connections between Israel as being civilized and modern as opposed to jihadis, or basically what they mean by that is the Palestinian people or Arabs in general. And there's another one that they started, was also on SF or San Francisco buses recently. It was about how, for example, gays are persecuted under Islam, etc., while showing really racist images of Muslim women on there. And then,
Yeah, I was going to give another example that something I experienced. I went to the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit. Was anybody else here there? So there was a workshop on the agenda for the social forum, until, it was there when we showed up, it was there in the planning stages, and I think it was called like LGBTQ liberation in the Middle East, or maybe LGBT liberation in the Middle East. And a bunch of us were like, weird, who's putting on this workshop? And we looked, and it was an exclusively Israeli affiliated presenters and not a single Arab presenter within this whole workshop. And so we recognized it was part of this propaganda campaign, this pinkwashing propaganda campaign, and there was a massive campaign by all the the organizing Arab delegates there to get it shut down, with a bunch of allies too. So anyway, it got shut down in the end, but that's the sort of thing, and that was deliberately placed within a really radical and progressive space to try and co-opt our discourse. That's another example.
yeah, and so what we're going to talk about now briefly is Brand Israel, which is basically this official program of the State of Israel that officially started in 2005, but the groundwork for it was being put in motion since 2001. And it's basically this campaign of making Israel seem modern and relevant. So a lot of things that I'm going to say, these are actual, later on we'll tell you where these are quotes from Israeli officials or people who work in Israeli consulates and etc. So what they started doing was hiring these like American or European PR firms and paying them millions of dollars to basically show this image of Israel as this great fun place, well, at first it was directed toward heterosexual people, but then later on they started to tailor their message to the LGBT community. So, for example, one thing that they started doing was trying to set Tel Aviv as the sort of the destination for gay tourism hotspot. So, for example, the Israel Tourism Board in 2010 they had a budget of $90 million just to rebrand Israel and specifically Tel Aviv as this gay-friendly place. Another thing also from 2010 was the budget for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to rebrand Israel in general was $26 million. And so another thing that they've also been trying to do that I think is really relevant is using academics and artists from Israel to promote this basically amazing image of Israel outside. So for example, they would have, for example, if an Israeli academic or artist wanted to go to this international conference or film festival and all these things, if they got Israel government funding, then they would have them sign this contract that basically said, and I'm going to quote, the service provider, meaning that artist or academic, is aware that the purpose of ordering services from him is to promote the policy interests of the State of Israel via culture and art, including contributing to creating a positive image for Israel. However, at the bottom they say, the service provider, again the artist or the academic, will not present himself as an agent, emissary, and a representative of the ministry, meaning the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So basically you see this sort of underhanded way that they're trying to do this is, for example, they would be sending films from Israel that show a positive image of Israel out and to all these international film festivals, but they would bar the filmmaker from saying that they are representing the State of Israel, even though they have to sign this contract that they are. The other example is also from somebody who works in the New York consulate of Israel, also said that they're trying to really tailor their message to the gay community because they think that gay community is a thing in New York and it's really huge. And well, the word they use is that the gay community is creating a buzz in New York. So they know that if they want to get this amazing picture of Israel out there, they have to tailor their message to gay and lesbian communities. Yeah.
I just wanted to give you a couple more quotes from the discussion of Brand Israel, the promotion of Brand Israel, the internal political discussion when they were forming it, because there are parts that are specifically relevant to college campuses, and I just wanted to mention them here. So I talked about proactive public relations drive on college campuses. It says, such public relations should cover both the subject of Israel and its history and the subject of radical Islam and the dangers that it unfolds. And this article I'm reading goes on to explain that, as you guys have probably seen, oftentimes instead of having the sort of discourse on campus looking like Israel first kind of stuff, it looks more like dialogue, narrative sharing. That's all we want is dialogue. All we want is, without any sort of context of power analysis and who's controlling the dialogue. And then the only other thing I wanted to say about Brand Israel is it arose out of this realization, this PR realization by the state that the world saw them exclusively through the Palestinian struggle. And so it's all about de-emphasizing that and emphasizing the culture and the technology and the scientific achievements of Israel and not talking about the conflict. All right, so I was going to tell you about QuAIA. We decided to start with that because it made a little more sense to explain why QuAIA exists if you knew what pinkwashing was to start with. So a bunch of us came together last spring in Seattle, a small bunch of us, because there was, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but there was a pinkwashing event, a series of pinkwashing events that came to town, one of which was super high profile, and we mobilized against them and actually got a couple of them shut down. And yeah, thanks, it was awesome. And there was this tremendous backlash afterwards, and the whole thing was really fascinating. And it raised a lot of awareness in queer community that some of it had been there, but it got people pissed off in a way that they weren't before. So we realized there was an opportunity to build something here. And also we realized that we're going to keep having to deal with this PR campaign, that it's going to be sticking around for a while. And so we need to have people mobilized to speak truth to it. So this Selma is going to be on the panel, and one other person who's part of our group went to the U.S. Social Forum in Brazil, the World Social Forum, thank you, in Brazil that was specifically focused on Palestine, and met with QuAIA representatives from Vancouver, Toronto, and Vancouver? Both. And felt like that was a good model and a cool organization that we could perhaps replicate in Seattle. So that's where the idea for Queers Against Israeli Apartheid came from. But QuAIA is not, there's not like an international chapter that tells us how we have to be. There's a lot of independence. So we're using a vague model. We have people to network with, but we locally determine what we want to do here. So, we're so young. We've only been meeting for a few months. Shima and I had to figure out how do we even talk about ourselves. So I'm going to do a little reading, actually. So we're a multiracial group of queer and trans-identified social justice activists, and we're committed to holding space in queer and also more mainstream LGBT community for Palestinian rights. We support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a means of bringing awareness, shifting long-standing power dynamics, and bringing urgently needed pressure on Israel to respect Palestinian rights. We stand against pinkwashing tactics and other Israeli propaganda. We see the connections between Palestinian liberation and all work for racial, gender, and disability justice, for LGBTQ liberation, against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia, and for a world without war, colonialism, imperialism, borders, or prisons. Another thing is that we see really similar tactics being used to justify war and sanctions in other parts of the Middle East in particular, probably elsewhere, but we particularly see this really vibrantly with Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so this is part of our analysis too, is that the strategy is something we oppose everywhere. So if you are queer identified, we would love to have you come to our meetings. Our next meeting is May 22nd, which is next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. And the address is on here. If you're interested in coming, please come. Please pick up one of these. If you can't make the next meeting but want to come to a meeting, our email address is on there, so just shoot us an email and we'll let you know what's coming up. And we also have a mailing list for folks that are just interested in hearing about events. You could be queer identified or not queer identified. And we haven't used it much so far, but we will be using it as we grow. So please sign up with us if you'd like to stay tuned.
Okay, thank you. All right, awesome. That's really great because I think a lot of the panelists are going to touch on some of the things that Layla and Shima brought up, and so feel free to enrich all that they said and mention things again, just so we can keep thinking about all that. It's a lot to take in. So now what we're going to do is we're going to introduce all the panelists with a little more detail, and then they're kind of going to go down the line and talk about their individual angles to everything. So, all right. Selma Al-Aswad is a queer Palestinian based in Seattle, Washington. As a member of the media collective Reteaching Gender Sexuality, Selma engages in media making as a way to engage conversations about queer complicity and resistance. She is a founding member of Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, QuAIA, in Seattle, who you just heard from, which was started after taking part in queer visions at the World Social Forum, Free Palestine, in Porto Alegre, Brazil.
Alok is a South Asian artivist who has performed and organized with queer movements around the world. They are committed to building radical queer movements and bodies that resist white supremacy and imperialism and like making art that thinks about these and other what-ifs. You can read some of their work at returnthegaze, .tumblr.com and queerlibido.tumblr.com.
And all those addresses are in your program too. You didn't memorize them instantly.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Jenny is a South Asian electron spinning around the Bay Area, making art and scholarship. They like thinking about apocalypse, decolonizing the food system, and making space for quantum queers everywhere. You can read some of their poetry at these addresses that I'm not going to say out loud, but they're in your program. And they're also the assistant editor over at blackgirldangerous.org.
One of the founders of the Seattle chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, Wendy creates and leads Jewish rituals that integrate Palestinian solidarity and Jewish spirituality. She has participated in anti-pinkwashing actions in Seattle and written about pinkwashing for Tikkun Magazine, Bitch Magazine, and Makeshift. In addition to writing and activism, she makes visual art, trouble, and macaroons in the Pacific Northwest.
Yay! So with that, we're going to go down the line and let these folks talk about their work. So, Wendy and Selma, you all want to start it off?
Okay.
We do. Get it.
So it was really great that Layla talked about the action last spring because that's what Selma and I are going to start off talking about. So it's going to be a little bit of us going back and forth talking about what happened. And then after that, I'm going to actually talk about the aftermath, which Layla also mentioned because there was a huge backlash against the action that we did. So this was last spring. My friend Selma and we were gripping each other's hands tightly. It was a Thursday night in March 2012, and we were at the Seattle LGBT Commission, and they were voting on whether to cancel this Israeli pinkwashing event, and it was actually scheduled for the very next day. And we had both spoken in favor of canceling the event, and I knew that Selma, as a queer Palestinian American, couldn't help but feel like they were actually voting on her personal story that she shared, and Layla also shared her personal story, which we'll talk about. And so for a few weeks prior to this night, a bunch of activists in the Pacific Northwest had mobilized to respond to the March Pinkwashing Tour, and it was called Rainbow Generations, Building New LGBTQ Pride and Inclusion in Israel. And so it sounds all nice, but Stand With Us and the Israeli consulate were actually the sponsors. So they sponsored 4 leaders of Israeli LGBT organizations to share the innovative work they're doing in Israel. This is a quote. Learn from counterparts in the U.S. and build relationships for future collaboration. So it sounds like it's about inclusion and pride and rainbows, but it's actually about a government campaign. So we were really inspired because activists actually got events in Tacoma and Olympia canceled. And so we had a coalition of Jewish and Palestinian queer folks come and attend the public meeting. And 2 of us Jewish Voice for Peace activists talked about what pinkwashing is. We talked about that we were opposed to the tour, and we explained that Stand With Us is actually a hate group. And we differentiated between being critical of the Israeli government and this campaign and actual instances of anti-Jewish oppression, that those are 2 different things. And then we addressed these sort of so basically what we did was kind of clear space. We addressed these objections to canceling the event. We said that we were Jewish people, we were for canceling the event, and then we created some space so that Layla and Selma could tell their stories.
And it really felt like it could only happen in a dream, what ended up happening, in that opportunities to genuinely describe the situation on the ground in Palestine and Israel in the past, in my experience organizing for many, many years in Seattle and in other places, have been met by oftentimes turned cheeks at best and death threats at worst. And as a queer Palestinian, the campaign of pinkwashing that Wendy described and that we've heard earlier seemed to push a stake in the most vulnerable part of my gut. So that night, with Layla, my Palestinian friend alongside me, and with Wendy, one of my fiercest allies, clasping my hand, we worked together so that my story and Layla's story could really be told and heard. I spoke with shaking hands, but clear fervor about how the commission, which, by the way, is an entity of City Hall, so it's really the city of Seattle that we were talking to. So with clear fervor, I spoke about how the commission, and therefore the city of Seattle, had really failed me as a constituent. I described how my life here in Seattle wasn't a coincidence. It was the ethnic cleansing of my ancestral home and the forced exile by my father in 1948 and the trajectories that followed that led me to being a refugee here on another type of colonized land. My queer identity is deeply steeped in and inextricably linked to the dispossession of my family and community by the state of Israel. It wasn't something just over there that had implications or relation to queerness here or to the Seattle LGBT Commission. To me, my exile was queerness. Layla, whose family has Israeli citizenship, explained how her family members were treated as 4th-class citizens within Israel. She described how her visits to Israel are accompanied by government harassment simply because of her ancestry. While these stories appear to affect everyone in the room, it still pretty much felt like the event was going to take place tomorrow as planned. And that's kind of what we internalized would happen because there's not a lot of victories in Palestine solidarity work, as you learn. You grow some thick skin. But then something completely extraordinary happened. I really believe that my vulnerability was unleashed and slowly began to cue other folks to deeply feel and demonstrate the same vulnerability. So with tears in his eyes and a shaking voice with emotion, one of the commissioners said that he felt he had made a huge mistake because they had no idea that the event that was going to be taking place meant marginalizing and invisibilizing Palestinian queer folks. Many commissioners described their own naivete when they agreed to host this event and their subsequent confusion. Stephanie Fox, who's a dear friend and fierce ally who also organizes with Jewish Voice for Peace, jumped in to point out how it was no coincidence that those folks felt confused, because pinkwashing propaganda is designed to obscure the truth. I beseech the commissioners to listen to their consciences. By being courageous and taking a stand to cancel this event, they'd be standing alongside many other national and international organizations and leaders who have said no to the exploitation of our queer community, to wash away war crimes, and continue to subjugate and oppress my family and my community.
So we watched, and then 6 out of the 8 commissioners raised their hands in favor of canceling the event. And then I just kept saying, it was a majority, it was a majority. Like, I couldn't quite comprehend that this had happened.
I really could not believe it. I actually closed my eyes, and I think Wendy was to the left of me, and I'm like, you count, I can't count. I had been in this position before, actually, at many actions clenching dear Wendy's hand in anticipation numerous times in the past, at die-ins, sidewalk protests, and marches. True story. But the responses have always been consistently the same. The responses by the public around have always been consistently the same. And here we were, goosebumps on the skin, sight of raised hands blurring in my vision, unable to fully comprehend Wendy's exclamation that it was a majority, and truly feeling that my story was told and heard. We hugged in joyful disbelief because something unusual really happened that night at City Hall. Palestinian American stories were put at the center. The commissioners listened to Layla and my moving testimonies and our experiences in activism as queer Palestinians, and these stories had actually prompted them to change their minds.
So outside of City Hall, our little group of activists, we have great pictures of it, so we were jumping up and down. We just kind of couldn't believe we had gotten that event canceled, and it felt like this big victory that also was only possible because we've all been working together sort of over the years and building up our relationships. And when they took the step of canceling that event, what they were doing was listening to their actual constituents, individual queer stories, and not letting money and the nation state of Israel and business as usual carry on. It was just a moment where we interrupted sort of business as usual, and I really think it was because they heard Layla and Selma speaking from their hearts, and it actually got in, because there wasn't all the usual trappings of we can just ignore this. Layla and Selma were really vulnerable about how painful this was to them, and then they actually we saw them, and they're not, they are unpaid, they are on this commission, and so, not to be cynical, but I think their hearts are a little more open, and they were moved, and that was what was so beautiful about it, is if you can make the space to tell these kind of stories, you can actually connect with people, and change can happen. So that was really exciting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the backlash, but don't let it bring you down. Because the fact is,
major BDS victory.
Yeah,
regardless.
it was. It was a victory, and then I think it's really interesting to look at what happened afterwards, just so we can know what to expect when we do get these kinds of wins. So a huge backlash got set in motion because they decided to cancel this event, and they did it, kind of almost the day out. It was the night before, and so the folks were already here, and they were canceling the event. So what happened is a lot of tropes, a lot of themes that we're going to hear again and again came up. So the safety of the Jewish community, people were suddenly feeling unsafe, and so that's a theme that we'll see again and again. And this was used to separate out queer issues from Israel-Palestine, and that's another theme that we'll see again and again, as though there are no queer Palestinians, this complete separation. So Stand With Us, which is a heinous group, they're a pro-occupation organization. They claimed in a press release that it was our goal to shut down conversation and deny Israelis the right to speak in the U.S. They included a statement from the Israeli delegation about their disappointment, and they said that the commission eliminated the opportunity for dialogue, and this is what Layla was mentioning, dialogue gets used a lot. We boycotted dialogue, they'll say. And that they were very sad because the commission, which represented a minority that continues to face discrimination, also practices that same discrimination. And so they kind of tried to turn things around. So there's you can see there's an accusation of anti-Semitism. It's couched in this claim that they were discriminated against based on their nationality. And that's not actually what was happening. We were saying don't do this because they're sponsored by the Israeli government and stand with us. And so that's the difference. And we had explained that numerous times, that it doesn't matter, you're gonna get accused of anti-Semitism. So they ignored the government backing, and they used that language of dialogue to like reverse power dynamics. So now they were the people being discriminated against. So the city council started to put a lot of pressure, right, onto the commissioners, and then they were getting, they were flooded with hate mail and calls, and so they ended up issuing a written apology. But doesn't matter because the event was canceled. Just remember that. it was disappointing, but it was a little bit, it's like we interrupted business as usual, and then like everything they had to scramble to make it look like business as usual. But the fact is, they were doing that because it wasn't like we had interrupted it. So they wrote this apology, and they claimed that their vote to cancel the event did not represent a stand for either side, but recognition that we could not facilitate a neutral space for dialogue again, and keep the conversation focused on LGBTQ issues versus the larger issues of Israel-Palestine. So again, these two things are being completely separated. So this idea that LGBTQ issues can and should be separated from Israel's occupation of Palestinian land, this relies on what's been happening in the LGBTQ movement, which is a sort of mainstreaming, and it isolates gay identity from all of our other identities. And it's the part of this move towards like inclusion and representation and assimilation. So just gonna give a quick little background on that. So in the 60s and 70s, as most of you know, gay liberation movements actually grew out of other liberation struggles that were happening. And they were deeply intertwined with feminist and anti-racist movements. So queer movements were about challenging capitalism, challenging racism, challenging state power, because gay lives were actually antithetical to mainstream society. And then over time, as LGBT rights have gained acceptance and gay activism has become more about institutions, the focus has started narrowing, and now it's about accessing state-based rights. So it's this sort of assimilationist model, and many LGBT groups have worked to gain inclusion into state institutions. So we see this in the like gay marriage, and then we see this in like, let us into the military, let us into these like oppressive institutions. So by making gay identity this distinct category that then gets aligned with the state, LGBTQ institutions have separated gayness from all of our other aspects and aligned gay rights with state rights. All right, I'm going to get into a little theory here. Stick with me. So Jasper Bjork talks about connecting LGBT assimilation to racism through her coinage of the term homonationalism. And it basically just means, it's like a fancy term that just means that mostly white LGBT folks in the global north who've gained certain legal rights then adopt their country's patriotism and racism. And then they're going to contrast their culture's sort of Western culture with that of the other, who are often Muslim, whose cultures are then positioned as rabidly homophobic. And so we see this like pinkwashing is just a case of homonationalism that the Israeli government has harnessed. And then the Western countries showcase LGBT rights as symbols of their sort of modern and progressive values. And so that's what's sort of happening with pinkwashing. And this discourse that was used in Seattle builds on this mainstreaming of the LGBTQ movement, and because it aligns gay civil rights, okay, that's the language they use, gay civil rights with state interests, and then Palestinian human rights are completely separate, that's a political issue, and it's very divisive. And so that's the separation that's being made. So we actually went to a city council meeting where they met to review the commissioner's decision and to kind of publicly get them to apologize and feel bad and make amends, etc. And during the time for public commentary, there was representatives, we were there in full force, and there were lots of folks who were saying we were really happy they canceled the event, and then there were a lot of folks from mainstream LGBTQ institutions and Jewish institutions saying that the cancellation again caused deep pain in the Jewish community, and then the Jewish community then is not us, right? So it's not Jews who are against the occupation of Palestinian land. It's not the Jews who wanted it canceled. It's only the Jews who are aligned with, say, the Jewish Federation. And so it's like pro-occupation Jewish community is the Jewish community. So that was one thing that happened. And then someone talked about how outside groups, although there's nothing actually outside about us. We are Seattle queer people who are their constituents. But outside groups took a non-political event and politicized what was supposed to be a cultural and civil rights exchange, which I know it boggles the mind. It's very confusing. So Many of the speakers then argued that the cancellation meant boycotting dialogue. And this is like very, they're very much, they know that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is growing, it's huge, it's gaining power. Yeah, and it's awesome. And so they're going to say that we're boycotting dialogue. We don't want to hear them talk. It's so terrible. And so this is a very specific strategy that I think we need to look out for and know what it means when they use dialogue, and we need to return the conversation to power. And that we were squelching free speech, because no one likes to squelch free speech, so that gets people going too. And so, so this was what they were trying to do to our action. But you have to wonder again, how did LGBTQ rights become cultural and not political? It's really disturbing, actually, to me, that's the division that's being made. So then there was this horrible open letter that a whole lot of LGBTQ organizations in Seattle signed on to. And they expressed their disappointment that the commissioners made a decision of canceling the event. And they called it a missed opportunity to celebrate our community's diversity. The letter went on to say that as we head into our own significant civil rights battle in Washington State, the trust and support of the Jewish community, again, is even more pivotal. And so now you see civil rights, when they're saying civil rights, they just mean gay marriage rights. And that was because they were up for a vote this past fall, right, and it passed. And so it's this real specific focus on state rights, and then that being it, and they don't care about human rights. So it's just, I think these are things to just keep in mind as we're doing pinkwashing actions about what's going to come up and how to respond, because they're going to use the concepts of dialogue, they're going to claim discrimination, they're going to use diversity, but it's a very narrow vision of gay rights, and it's aligned with state rights. And so I'm just saying that we need to think about keeping the power analysis always in the center, considering who is being excluded when we talk about safety, who's being excluded when we talk about rights, and thinking about always making sure that this is an anti-colonialist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist struggle. And so I think just to sum up, our strategy was sort of centering and listening to queer Palestinian voices and making sure they got heard. And refusing, as queer folks, we have to refuse to let our identities be used to justify oppression anywhere, because that's not queer liberation. Queer liberation means it's never going to come at the cost of denying someone else their rights, their human rights. So that's sort of the story that I wanted to tell, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell it.
I, along with you, Wendy, have to keep reminding myself it was still a victory, it's still a victory.
Yeah.
And I forgot that, as I began to meet other activists in Palestine solidarity work across the country, and there's just so many letdowns, and I forget that Seattle was a center of a major BDS victory because it was a city council event, and they canceled it. And I didn't think it was going to happen. There's not a lot of Arabs here. And I just get used to Seattle and Pacific Northwest not being a hub of where something like that could happen. I'm San Francisco, maybe Chicago, maybe Vancouver, Toronto, but no, Seattle. So I just want to start with saying I have warm kind of nostalgic feelings from being here. I want to thank all the sponsors. Once upon a time as an undergraduate was a Women's Action Commission director. I also was a member of SJP, or Students for Justice in Palestine, so kind of the pre-Super UW manifestation of Palestine solidarity organizing on campus, and it's just a perfect fit. I am so elated that the Queers Student Commission, the Women's Action Commission, and Super UW putting this on together. I'm just shit, couldn't this have happened 5 years ago? Awesome. I'm just super happy about that. And also I just think it's really special to have this event around the same time that we're commemorating the Nakba, because I really feel that pinkwashing aims to continue and perpetuate the Nakba, right? The Nakba was not this one-time event. The catastrophe started maybe in 47, 48, but it's still continuing today. And I think it's really beautiful to commemorate and talk about it by centering queer resistance and activism. So to start off sharing, I guess I could just say that I got the opportunity to be part of a series of conversations called Queer Visions at the World Social Forum. And this past November, the first ever kind of themed World Social Forum on issues of Palestine were to be held in Brazil. And I was so grateful that I could have attended alongside around 16 other activists from all over the country to specifically talk about queer visions and queer resistance to the ongoing occupation and colonization of Palestine, and to specifically insert and to garner more support around saying no to pinkwashing and to claim that actually sexual and bodily rights are being used to perpetuate colonization in Palestine, and we should talk about that as all people, not just queer and trans people. And that was a really, really exciting opportunity for me, and as Layla said, it kind of, I went alongside with a good friend, Dean, and when we returned, we found it as a really good time to be able to start up and really put organization to the momentum that's been growing in Seattle, especially since last spring, which is when this pinkwashing, this major pinkwashing, anti-pinkwashing victory happened. And so, as an aside, I since being a student, since I've just been staying and working and living in Seattle, and one of the things that's closest and dearest to my heart, which was kind of named during my intro speech, was I organized with this organization called Reteaching Gender Sexuality. Yay, RGS. And RGS really is just a collective of folks who like to use media as a way to showcase and talk about queer resistance and queer complicity. We recently just wrapped up a short comedy video, so we're kind of going all over the map. But what I love about it, it's a way to really try to re-politicize our queer identities, especially in Seattle, and to move away from the mainstreaming that Wendy really eloquently talked about within the LGBT community. And both one of my co-organizers, Sid Jordan, who couldn't be here tonight, and I have to give mad props to him because what I'm about to kind of share is a piece that he and I developed together. And so as we were organizing around RGS, RGS was really born out of a lot of frustration that young people and adults had in Seattle around the conversations that were taking place a few years ago after a lot of highly publicized queer youth suicides. And there was a lot of interventions that became popular that were springing up. Local celebrity Dan Savage had a really big project that launched, and there was a lot of people taking the same kind of word, and we were really frustrated. So we've been talking about safe space and critiquing safe space for a while, and as we were really integrating it with our Palestine solidarity work, we really realized that the idea, the marketing of safe space is not actually at all different than Brand Israel, right? It's marketing with safe haven, but it can be done on a small scale and it can actually be done on a national scale. And I believe it was said that Brand Israel allocated even just 1 year $90 million to target Tel Aviv to be the gay capital. So it could actually be done on multiple scales. And recently, Sid and I were able to present in New York about connecting the safe space movement that we see as ever growing as kind of the tool for queer, especially queer youth liberation, with some of the things that we see as key components of pinkwashing, Israeli pinkwashing. And so it's kind of chopped up since Sid couldn't be here to read this part, but he shared a little bit about of case study of what happened in Seattle a couple years ago when a group of folks came together to create a youth-centered space that they started calling Queer Space. And there's some awesome key players in here who were founding members, including myself and Sid. And so we were talking about some of the responses to that, which really show how safe space that was led by queer youth in Seattle was really a threat to kind of this mainstream LGBT straw man in Seattle. So queer youth space is described as a queer anti-violence model that views self-determination as a prerequisite to safety rather than the other way around. Where the politics of safety for queer youth are had to be thought of differently, not linked to arbitrary, prescribed, or paternalistic views of youth and adult capabilities. The perceived threat that queer youth space posed to the established order within Seattle's so-called gay scene is worthy of a much more diligent analysis. But just for this context only, we really want to speak a little bit about what happened, or Sid spoke a little bit about what happened in the fall of 2010 when there was a lot of media blitz on queer youth suicide that really put in forefront of the lives of queer youth. And so we came up as an organization around Reteaching Gender Sexuality, a first PSA video to contribute to social media dialogue being driven by It Gets Better. But it evolved into a deeper educational project. So our workshops dealt with a range of issues, one key theme called Rethinking Safe Space. As we prompted a dialogue around the contradictions and compromises faced in the centralized and clear anti-bullying interventions, both in the obscuring of institutional structural violence and in lending to adverse impacts of anti-bullying policies on queer youth, notably the further entrenchment of the reliance on disciplinary interventions that fuel the school to prison pipeline, etc. So that's just a little background on kind of just the conversations on safe space that was happening. And now I want to talk about the connective politics of rethinking safe space, which is kind of the central model of our organizing on reteaching gender sexuality and opposing pinkwashing. And there's kind of three main things I just want to talk about to kind of get the juices flowing. They could definitely be sewn into a larger kind of conversation, but I would love to just kind of put it out there. So Sid and I and others in our group have begun working on reteaching or rethinking safe space. It became an opportunity for me to link my anti-apartheid activism and my personal and family experience as a Palestinian in the diaspora through a natural link to what I saw with the pinkwashing of Israel, and particularly the rhetoric of Israel as a safe haven for queer people. Through the notion of safe space by schools or community centers or spaces in the US is vastly different from brand Israel's pinkwashing strategies. Reteaching Gender Sexuality, or RGS, which I'm going to be using a lot, has been working towards making this link in some of our work in order to build political consciousness and break down some of the key barriers to both understanding and responding to pinkwashing. In the past 12 months alone, we've seen incredible pinkwashing efforts in Seattle. For example, the Israeli consulate-sponsored cultural events, Israeli films like Invisibilizes in our Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, and an Israeli queer fact-sharing tour. Only in like the past 12 months alone. So we've had such a presence of pinkwashing in our community. It's allowed us to make the connection and use RGS as a vehicle to raise awareness. And so in consideration of the time I have here, I will just speak about three concepts. The first, to link what I see with the kind of the growing safe space movement as an intervention for queer youth bullying, or just as an intervention for queer violence, and drawing the connection with Israeli pinkwashing or brand Israel tools. The first and perhaps most obvious is the marketing or currency of safety. I don't know how many of you have done this. I'm speaking on a college campus, but when I was a student, I definitely took part and facilitated like safe zone or safe space trainings. And I'm saying that because I just really want to preface that I actually have a soft spot in my heart for like particular trainings that facilitate safe spaces, even though I have a particular critique of it. I've done it all over this campus when I was a student here. I actually think that it has actually benefited and changed the way people like have conversations at Queer. So I definitely want to give that shout out, and also just like come humbly as I've done this. But if you don't know what it is, a safe zone training is like a program where you go to a community or group or classroom and talk about oppression and homophobia. And at the end, oftentimes when I did them, at the end, participants are often granted a certificate saying they've completed the training, and this certificate can be, or a placard can be placed in an office or in a window to show that this place is now safe, or they are a safe person to talk to about gay things. And the reason I bring this up, like I said, is because in my work with RGS, I've really grown a critique around safe space trainings, and I'm also aware that it can be helpful in many instances. So many of us have been part of programs that have delivered these types of trainings, and in some ways still do in some ways. But our observations and experiences of youth programs are set up for both the trainer and the learner or the participant. I actually remember Sid, who again is my co-presenter who's invisible today, telling me this story of where he went to a classroom and had only 1 hour to do a training in a class, and one of the teachers asked him for a poster at the end, and he's like, what kind of poster? And then realized that the teacher was talking about like a sort of safe space, pink triangle or something to show. And then she remembers how the teacher had a hard time even saying the word gay during the whole day. And like, it's just interesting to think of like what would it really mean for that person to put up that poster or that sticker. The end point for many of the open-minded trainees is to showcase a rainbow or maybe a pink triangle or something in a space without the critical tools to actually address root causes of queer targeted violence. So that's part of the critique that we see in some of the programs. Now, many schools don't even have access to such trainings or materials, but with increased state legislation for enforcing anti-bullying policies, we see schools being mandated in contract training for anti-bullying trainings or workshops. In our conversations, we found that many anti-bullying programs in schools often do little to address violence and isolate students who transgress norms of gender and sexuality. We encountered unprepared teachers and administrators who had very basic questions. And while legislation and policy focuses on youth peers as the key agents of homophobia, and that adults within a school are somehow equipped to protect queer youth and address this. Instead, we found that educators were more often complicit or even impacted themselves by the same conditions or environments that drive isolation and violence. But it's become, addressing anti-bullying has become so palpable and attractive. Schools like they buy a solution if there is some sort of package that can be delivered. And unpacking the roots of structural violence can be really daunting. And so if there's something that seems credible and affordable, then that's alluring. So within the context of Israeli pinkwashing, that's kind of just like some of the critiques on safe space when it's in like a US context or on schools. But within the context of Israeli pinkwashing, the onus of citizens to make their communities more just and more equipped to combat oppression and make a more liberated space for themselves is waived. Young people who've seen their schools put up rainbows or even do training often report that safe spaces or schools incorporate queer youth into an existing structure. And this really diffuses the needs for schools to be changed. Queerness poses an inherent challenge to existing power dynamics of a school. A top-down declaration that a school is safe seeks to make the school safe from queerness rather than make queer youth safe in school. A safe school for queer youth would be one that had to dramatically change the participation and leadership of queer young people or queer students, rather than one that sought to incorporate queer youth into the status quo. Much like with purchasable safe space solutions, I believe safe haven declaration tactics only limit the community and individuals' creative solutions, notably in Israel and Palestine. Young people know from their own experiences that a rainbow flag or a safe zone placard does not equal a liberatory classroom or even an equitable one. And in exploring this with students, we could really build around the analysis of the idea of marketing and co-optation of brand Israel. So RGS actually utilizes this conversation to engage young people and students into being politicized about Palestine, specifically around safe space. So the second point of connection is the negation of the other. With this, we think we can also make some loose connections in popular culture to talk about how pinkwashing tactics that posit Israel as a gay Mecca or a safe haven is also used to reinforce notions of the Arab world surrounding it, right? That's the other. The homophobic, unsafe other. Spaces that are unsafe, inhabited by Arab peoples. And in this, there's a divisive threat to solidarity from within Israel. If safe space or safe havens can be had, why is homophobia not actually dead in Israel itself within the 40 borders? Queer Israelis have the potential to identify with, or queer Israelis and Israelis that transgress the norms of gender and sexuality have the potential to identify with and create bonds of solidarity with other oppressed and marginalized people, yet the incorporation into a safe haven can hinder a revolutionary potential of solidarity. So I actually think that the government's tactics within also really inhibit queer and radical folks in Israel, whether they're Jewish Israel or not, to really create alliances with other oppressed and marginalized groups in Israel and Palestine, notably Palestinians. The incorporation into a safe space mentally might diffuse the subversive potential of queer youth and resisting school discipline. So this is how I connect it back to kind of this idea of like safe space in the schools. And the belief in safe havens can diffuse the potential of queer youth and resisting the Zionist project. So the third point, my last point of connection, is this allure of inclusion. I think it really also speaks to some of the things that Wendy's talking about with kind of where the movement has moved. So whether it's the inclusion politic of safe space and how it might maintain power inequities in schools and disciplinary or criminalizing policies that particularly impact queer people of color, or whether it's the politic of a safe haven that pinkwashes a system of apartheid policies in Israel, we see the way that this marketing is productive and seductive. It suggests to queers that this is the safety that we need. Like there is an other, whether it's an administration, the school or whether it's like an actual national body saying, here's safety, we know how to give it to you, just follow these rules. And it is this seduction that can ultimately inhibit spaces that are liberatory. It like inhibits the revolutionary potential of queerness. It limits our imaginations about our own needs and our own ways of imagining safety and our own radical potential for self-determination. So that's all I have for that. But I want to kind of end with just actually something I wanted to tie it back to the Nakba and how it's really special for me to be talking with you today on what is around the 65th anniversary of ongoing occupation and colonization of Palestine. I was reading this article that was called Why I Celebrate Nakba. And so, I always say that we're doing a Nakba commemoration. We're commemorating this disaster, this catastrophe. Nakba actually means the catastrophe in Arabic. And this writer brilliantly writes that amidst this 65 years of dispossession, of loss of home and farmlands and people and communities, this like 65 years of miscarriage that Palestine has been experiencing, that we are resisting. And the example of the major BDS victory in Seattle within the past 12 months is a profound example of how we are resisting, and that's why I'm celebrating that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit more and try to tease out the dynamics of pinkwashing and how they're operating at the global stage. So we've talked a lot about what's happening right now in the apartheid state of Israel, but most of my solidarity experience has been organizing with queer movements in South Africa and in India. And I want to talk about essentially how these are all interconnected, which I really appreciate what we're doing is we're taking these dynamics and actually revealing how they have pertinence in many different settings. And I want to emphasize a little bit on what it means to envision South-to-South solidarities. So one of my biggest critiques thus far of the transnational anti-pinkwashing movement is that it's largely been dominated by Western countries. It's largely been dominated by white Jewish voices in those Western countries, and that queer people of color have not really been as involved with Palestinian solidarity and with transnational work more broadly. And that in my organizing and transnational activisms, most black queer folks in South Africa and most brown queer folks in India don't know anything about Palestine. And why is this happening? So I want to talk a little bit about those circuits as well. So to begin with, I want to focus on how pinkwashing is part of a larger tool of settler colonialism and imperialism, and trying to unpack what it is about sexuality itself that allows and justifies settler colonialism to exist. So sex has always been a product of empire. And it's important to locate that historically. That colonization has always used this trope of the native having this sort of perverse sexuality, and the modern subject is being able to have this sort of more appropriate sexuality. So if you look at the discourse justifying colonialism in South Africa, the way that black people were discussed was essentially, oh, they're incredibly sexual, they're having orgies all the time, they have same-sex sexualities, they cross-dress, this is really gross and backwards. And part of the justification for settling in that area was, we're gonna be here and fix them, we're gonna make them modern. And part of that modernizing project was this idea of sexual orientation. So I want to locate also lesbian and gay identities as part of that project of empire. One of the things that I've been really frustrated about in the way that we do this transnational work is that we see it as sufficient just to have sort of LGBT solidarity across the world, without actually questioning how those LGBT identities are also located within histories of empire. Because essentially what LGBT was about fixing one sexual identity around a particular sexual object, right? Saying, I'm gay means I'm attracted to these people, which is a very individualistic way of understanding and conceptualizing sexuality that has a very particular history. So when we're talking about queer solidarities, I think it's important for us to actually not envision queer as sort of post-LGBT, but rather a decolonized LGBT. And that's a semantic shift that I think is incredibly important. And what I see a queer project about is actually about learning the histories of LGBT liberation, revisiting the histories of LGBT progress, and and locating how those were entrenched in white supremacy and entrenched in settler colonialism. And that a queer struggle is really one in which recognizes that it's not that we're advancing new genders and sexualities, but rather that we are forgetting the genders and sexualities that were imposed on us by empire. But what we see happening across the world is this new sort of phenomenon of a transnational or global gay identity. So for example, next year in Toronto, there's going to be a World Pride. And across the world, you're seeing new prides in London and San Francisco, where the theme is being World Pride. So this idea that gay people exist across all cultures and across all times is a new sort of trend within the gay movement. Within the past few years, you've seen an unprecedented amount of support from the US government for international LGBT rights. The Obama administration has allocated $3 million to the US State Department to fund international LGBT social movements. So here we're provided with this paradox where the US State Department is probably the largest site of imperialist terrorism in the world, but is now funding and supporting LGBT social movements abroad. And they're actually tapping into progressive NGO structures in the US, like the Estrella Foundation for Lesbian Justice, and using those to transfer that money. And so what we're seeing now is that Obama, that sort of this liberalism is really into helping gay people abroad. And rather than actually questioning that, queers have largely been like, yeah, we need to build global solidarity around LGBT issues. You see a lot of progressive lesbian and gay activists in the US say like, oh, gay people are being killed in Uganda. Gay people, and in particular in my focus of my work, this notion of lesbian corrective rape in South Africa. So you see a lot of white gays and lesbians in the US saying, black lesbians are being raped in the townships in South Africa, we need to save them. Well, it's not actually, no one's actually checking the assumption that creating this solidarity on the basis of your sexual orientation located in the West with this idea of sexual orientation elsewhere is a really flawed project. Because what's getting lost in all of that is race, class, and a position, both ideologically and economically, in the global South versus the global North. So what happens is this sort of solidarity among global LGBT peoples is constructed. And that's really a fabrication, because across the world, gay identity is not actually there. The only places where gay identity really exists, and what I mean when I say gay identity is the ability to create an identity around one's sexual preference, are in areas that have been influenced by Western imperialism or settler colonialism. But the paradigm that gets set up is that cultures that don't have gay identity are seen as backwards and primitive, and cultures that have gay identity are seen as progressive. So let me move, for example, to my work in India. So what you're seeing right now in India is that the working class, majority, lower caste people use indigenous terms to describe their sexuality, like khoti or panti, meaning recessive or penetrative role in a sex act. And these are largely masculinist terms, and we can talk about that in the Q&A as well. But what now happens is that transnational corporations have started making new companies in India and having non-discrimination policies. So Goldman Sachs will enter Bangalore and say, oh, we protect on the basis of sexual orientation. So within the past decade, you've seen the emergence of a gay rights movement in India, but it's a largely middle-class, English-speaking gay rights movement. And in 2009, sodomy was decriminalized in India. But the sodomy laws, by the way, were put into place by the British when they colonized India. And then when in the justification in the Supreme Court case, the rhetoric around why sodomy was decriminalized was because it was seen as India becoming a more civilized nation. That's in the actual court ruling. And what I bring up this point because it's not as easy anymore to just say white gays and lesbians against brown folks. It's also upper class brown people within the global South oppressing working class people within the global South as well. So we can't even rely on this unproblematized notion of like, oh, we have a representative here from India or from the global South speaking about what's going on. Because already there's so many assumptions being made if you only choose someone who's speaking to you in English, if you only choose someone who's speaking through an NGO or even through a governmental model. So what we see now with the proliferation of a middle-class gay movement in India is this idea that most Indian people are in the closet and are therefore backwards, that these working-class people are dirty. So part of the rhetoric that you see in India, when I went there, was so fascinating because most of them would ask me, have you ever fucked a white man before? And I would say, why do you want to know this? And they would say, oh, they're cleaner, right? And I was like, how do you know, like what? And they're like, oh, I watched porn. They're the only people there. They're beautiful. The men that I sleep with in India are all dirty and smell bad, and they're all repressed because they don't see this as part of their identity, so they can't fall in love with me. And I introduced this example to show the ways that how deeply entrenched a particular notion of not just gay identity is disseminating around the world, but gay lifestyle. So we can't actually talk about the global gay without also talking about what kind of cultures around gayness are being mandated across the world. It's a culture that can only be accessed by a particular type of racial aesthetic, both in terms of desire and in terms of class. So the only people who are allowed to be authentically gay are upper class people who can go to the club on the weekend and live a sort of trendy and sexy lifestyle. So the way that imperialism brands itself and the way that Israel is branding itself is not just about we are a gay-friendly place, but it's also we are a sexy place, we are a desirable place. And I want to incorporate that into the way that we conceptualize pinkwashing as well, because pinkwashing isn't just about saying, oh, this is bad because these policies are bad, but it's also about looking within the deepest parts of ourselves and recognizing what we have been taught to be attracted to, what we find aesthetically pleasing is actually part of the project of empire. Because the only ways that we've been taught to even see ourselves as queer is by the standards of what empire dictates. And one of the issues that I began with is saying that the solidarity movement has largely been dominated by Western white voices. And I think part of that is, in my opinion, a displacement. Because what I see happening here is an inability for Western queers to actually interrogate the ways in which their own identities participate within systems of imperialism. And therefore transnational work becomes a way to sort of absolve oneself of guilt and say, oh, you know, I'm doing this transnational organizing. But what I really would ask that we begin to do is how can we envision queerness about decolonization of our own selves, rather than marketing and branding it as this new sort of philosophy inspired by postmodernism and post-structuralism. It's rather about actually saying, no, you know what? Like, indigenous societies across the world were so queer, had it all figured out for a long time. And then this enforcement of gay and lesbian identities was part of a project of imperialism and colonialism. Next, I want to bring up what's happening in South Africa to also complexify the way that we've been discussing and continue to discuss pinkwashing. So South Africa has the most progressive constitution in the world. As of 2009, same-sex marriage was legalized, and in 1984, the advent of the new democracy, sexual orientation was incorporated into the non-discrimination policy. But what you've seen is that in the past decade, there's been an increase in violence directed against Black queer people, but there's also been an increase in queer life for white queer people. So what's essentially happened is now you can go to Cape Town, like Tel Aviv, and Cape Town markets itself as, quote, the San Francisco of Africa. And markets itself as a sort of global gay city where everyone can go to and have fun. There's a village in the town itself called the Waterkant, which is the gay village, that markets itself as being, once again, one of these global gay destinations. You can go and meet people from all across the world who come to Cape Town to party in these particular places. But yet, a stone throw away down the road, you see the same apartheid-era economic systems still in place, where the majority of Black people are unable to access basic access to electricity or healthcare. And the experiences of queer people in the townships is fundamentally different to those of the city center. So the majority of Black queers in the townships are facing continual struggle. I was organizing with a transgender organization there called Gender Dynamics, and most of my colleagues would go home being afraid that they would get raped, or being afraid that they would get killed. And what happens in a place like South Africa is that in 1 second, you're able to be in some of the most lavish decadence in the world, and then 2 seconds later, you're in absolute abject poverty. But yet, the way that which LGBT identity becomes a way to stabilize this class and racial warfare. Because white gays and lesbians are able to say, oh, they're part of our community. And the way that they theorize that violence is that these Black queer people are being attacked by homophobes. But what that does, once again, is participate in the demonization of Black and brown bodies. So what you do is you blame Black and brown people for being, quote, homophobic, without actually talking about the structural conditions that facilitate that homophobia. So what I'm trying to also to gesture to in this conversation is the ways in which Israel creates this image of the homophobic Palestinian, distracts away from the systemic economic systems that have been put into place, economic and cultural systems of apartheid. And the way that violence is theorized is only interpersonal. So Black and brown people are fighting one another, but what I would argue is that there's always the white imperial power system that's defining who's doing what. But yet, South Africa, as it gets evoked in the world stages, as the most progressive place in the world. So you see in the United States, or in the United Nations, South Africa is continually congratulated as being the country in Africa that's a moniker, an example of what other African countries should aspire to. And what's happening now is that refugees from all across Africa are fleeing to South Africa to seek asylum. But then once they get there, they're like, whoa, this isn't actually anything better. So for example, a lot of the work that I was working on there was on queer asylum seekers to South Africa. And one of the cases we had was a transgender woman from Malawi who's barely spoke any English. And in the time that we were working with her, even just trying to find housing for her, she was routinely beaten and raped on the streets for being an outsider, one, and then also for being queer. But yet these narratives don't circulate in the way that we discuss South Africa. And the way that we discuss South Africa is we believe that South Africa is a new nation rather than a settler colonial project. And that narrative of white people came to our country and took everything, but then we use the Constitution and we use the state to actually pretend that that didn't happen. Which leads to a next point about the ways in which pinkwashing discusses the state and the Constitution more generally. I argue, and a lot of people have argued before, that the state and that laws are really just a way to perpetuate power and dominance for white people. And that's the exact same thing that we're seeing happen within Israel, and we're seeing happen in the United States as well. That the law and the Constitution becomes a way to perform this image to the global stage that you're actually got everything under control, but then what doesn't actually get discussed is what's happening on the ground. So even the very realm of visibility, even what we have been taught to see, is already always racialized, which complexifies our understandings of pinkwashing, not just as a set of structural policies that's being practiced by the state of Israel, but also one that is creating an aesthetic image, as I said, of this sort of like party, capitalist gay lifestyle, but one that's already always a racialized project, and that we have to ask, who are we not seeing? Who becomes invisibilized? Once again, that question of the other. And what I want to also bring up in the case of South Africa is South Africa allows us to see the ways in which LGBT identities participate in the same colonial era practices of modernizing sexualities. So I discussed sort of how missionary settler colonialism in South Africa was concerned with civilizing black sexualities. So you saw the introductions of Christianity, you saw black people basically being taught that homosexuality was wrong, what they were doing was wrong, and that they needed to be heterosexual, that they needed to enter these particular types of heteronormative kinship structures. But now what you're seeing is a new discourse that's basically about making and creating new black gay subjects to legitimize the project of empire. So let me unpack what that means. There's an organization in South Africa called the Out in Africa Film Festival, which is a gay and lesbian film festival that goes into the townships and shows gay and lesbian media into the townships. And they see it basically as their project to help black South Africans find liberation. But the way that they actually justify that is they say, we had 10 new black people come out to us today after watching these movies. And what's so fascinating is that this discourse around saving people through missionary colonialism has become so smart that we can see gay and lesbian rights as just creating people who look just like us all around the world. And so what you're seeing now in South Africa is this idea that black people are too conservative or primitive or too closeted to access a gay identity. But once they do, they get folded into this multicultural rhetoric where we can say, look, we have black gays and lesbians as well, so we're part of this community. And that extension or that creation of the community allows white people to not have to feel complicit within empire, because you're able to say, oh, look, they're just like us. So LGBT as a framework allows people to fabricate solidarity without actually talking about race and class. So what I'm sort of arguing for today is how can we envision a type of transnational solidarity that's not rooted actually in a shared assumption of a lesbian and gay identity, that's not rooted in an assumption of sexuality, that still has an analysis of the ways in which sexuality propagates a project of empire, but rather is not saying because we are queers here and queers there, we should be doing this work. And one thing I want to close on is that piece I was talking about what it means to think about decolonizing queerness within the Western world. So I've been thinking a lot about how to mobilize queer people of color located in the Western world to care about transnational issues like Palestine. But one of the issues with doing transnational work is that if you're a brown queer person in the US, you're already struggling with a lot of shit here. You don't really have time to think like, oh, how can I really help out across the world? Because you already are experiencing criminalization and police violence here. And that's why when I think about what's happening in Palestine, I think about what's happening with the prison system here. I think about these sorts of connections and the ways that it's so easy to look abroad and say, this is what's happening, but not actually interrogate what's happening here. And I want to think, when I don't actually know what a South-to-South solidarity looks like, but I think that we need to begin to think about that piece of this conversation in a way that's not being thought of right now. How can we think about doing pro-Palestinian work while also helping brown people in the US? How do we make parallels between the ways in which the Israeli state government is practicing, but not just also the state government, but also gay and lesbian society more generally, maybe not even through using the laws of legislation, but using the laws of desire, using the laws of capital, using the laws of who gets into my club or not, those types of exclusions. How is that being practiced in the United States as well to contribute to the erasure and representation of Black and queer sexualities as wrong or aberrant? So one of the phenomena that we see in the US is that Black people are inherently homophobic. We saw this happen with Proposition 8 in California. There's this continual rhetoric around Black people just not understanding sexuality. There's this rhetoric once again around Asian Americans as being really traditional and into family values. But what all this is cloaked racism that once again locates a person of color as somehow not modern and white people as somehow modern, and lesbian and gay identity is seen as the ultimate sort of holy grail of what it means to become modern, not just at the transnational stage, but also at the domestic stage. So when I think that we're talking about what South-to-South solidarity looks like, I think it's about resisting a particular representation of queer life. So as one of my colleagues was talking about earlier about the ways in which the contemporary gay movement in the US has become more about assimilation. But I like to think about that in terms of what type of body and what type of person do people think of when they think of queerness. What they think of is this very palatable image of like a gay person who just wants to get married. Because that's very not threatening or not assuming, and you can incorporate that into your already analysis. But what we need to actually envision is representations of queerness that are profoundly disruptive, that are profoundly ugly, that are profoundly not hot, that are profoundly not sexy, that are resisting all those layers that are trying to make us out to be this sort of idealized image, once again. We need to envision a queerness that is not necessarily just about sexuality and gender, but a queerness that's more about transgression more broadly.
So in the spirit of full disclosure, Alok and I often identify as a single organism. So we had to make a division in the things that we talk about. And so Alok frequently centers their analysis more on colonialism, and I frequently center my analysis largely on capitalism. So capitalism, a few of us talk about it, most of us do it. So capitalism is sort of the framework that I'm going to use to structure the things that I want to talk about, right? First, I want to really talk about this word homonationalism and whence it came. So Wendy set up Jasbir Puar's work, Terrorist Assemblages, which was sort of the seminal work that brought this word homonationalism to the forefront. And then Alok also set up in their argument that homonationalism is something that queer people of color have already known and acknowledged for millennia, right? Like that these categories of queer and people of color are already things that are produced by empire and by capitalism. And that this rise of this term, right, homonationalism, just gave word to experiences that were bracketed in a sense, right? Like this is just a specific phenomenon that is happening now, but in fact, people of color sexualities have always been considered perverse, right, and antithetical to the conjugal modernity. So if we think about what is the role of the academy in advancing our social movements, or in relating to our social movements, we start to think about, okay, what is capitalism? What is going on here? The word capitalism contains this sort of root capital, and then this agent, the capitalist. The capitalist is the one who controls the means of production. In the case of academia, the products are knowledge, our ideas, our concepts, our language, our words like homonationalism. The person who controls the means of production is the academic, the one who, especially the ones who have gotten tenure, right, or are on tenure tracks, are in a middle class position and are talking about social movements and frequently not involved in them. So you have this term emerging, which more and more is less in conversation with the actual social movement and the on-the-ground work that is happening, particularly in the situation of Israel and Palestine. Actually, the three of us were at the Homonationalism Conference last month in New York, and over the course of a 2-hour keynote, Jasbir Puar managed to mention the word Israel once, right? So this is a term that's being quickly divorced of its actual social movement context. So what does that mean for us, right? You have these academics who are controlling the ways that we talk about and situate our social movement work, or are ostensibly trying to do that, but they're completely sort of abstracted from this concept. And this is where I want to situate the academy as actually perpetuating and maintaining hegemony. Because if they don't maintain that hegemony, they don't have anything to theorize, right? So social movement work is then exploited. The unwaged labor of people who are doing the social movement work is then exploited by the capitalist, who in this case is the academic, to produce more discourse, to produce more nuance in particular, to produce something very abstract and inaccessible to the people who are doing the social movement organizing. So when we think about where we should be getting our ideas and perspectives on what to do next, the call is not for more and more nuance, to complexify these narratives and to use words like complexify and discourse and talk about these things in abstract and sort of inaccessible ways. But it should be emergent from the struggle itself, right? From the perspectives and words of people who are involved in doing the work. And I think that's where we can start to look at our position, especially most of us who are involved in universities in various capacities. Thinking about universities as sites of power and capital, rather than as sites of all-knowingness and knowledge production as a supreme project. So if we think about the ways that we can bring activists to our campuses to discuss issues and redistribute the resources of our universities in doing so, or use research grants to actually be doing social movement work, right? So reframing our positions in the academy as ones of resisting capitalist projects rather than continuously being complicit within them. So then I want to move to Israel, right? The brand Israel entity, which I think the folks from QuAIA set up really well. There is a reason that it is called brand Israel, right? And it's not just because Israel is doing something very exceptional. The project of building a nation state is already a project of marketing and PR, regardless of what nation state that is. This is especially true in the case of the United States. And so when I think about what the invention of modernity is, right, in this case, Israel is branding itself as modern and progressive. The invention of modernity is the invention of a capitalist modernity. And it is always a modernity that is meant to stabilize whatever other chaos is already always happening. And it is a modernity that is built on the exploitation of particular bodies. In the case of the United States, it was built on the enslavement of Black people and the erasure of indigenous people from their land, right? In the case of Israel-Palestine, it is the occupation and stealing of Palestinian people's resources. So when you reframe modernity as not this project that is sort of shiny and new and always advancing, but actually one that is just masking violence that is already happening, we start to see the ways that brand Israel, right, is just an explicit framing of something that every nation state is already doing. And something that we can resist much more broadly, right? That resisting the strategies of brand Israel to market itself as shiny and new by using these markers of inclusion is really just a reincorporation of our particular communities, whether they be in this case the LGBT community, into a capitalist project of state formation. And so when I think about also, I think what Alok set up really well about queer identities that resist, empire, and not even thinking about ourselves as sort of queer people, but as people, and thinking about our queerness as already always complicit in empire. They are also already always complicit in capitalism. Queerness, especially sort of in the Western world, is something that is increasingly purchased. Whether that be, going to the club and forming this thing called a queer community, or in my case, situating myself as a transmasculine person, right? Trans has sort of become framed in the West, in particular, as this sacrosanct category that cannot be criticized for the ways that it perpetuates systems of violence, economic injustice itself. My testosterone is manufactured in Israel, right? Like, my very purchase into transmasculinity and my particular form of queerness is shackled to Israeli Zionist capitalism. So when we think about, what voices our movements are centering, and how those are complicit in racism and capitalism. A friend of mine made a really important critique the other day that most sort of trans panels featuring transmasculine voices tend to be transmasculine voices who are on testosterone, right? Who have particular class, geographic access to this medical industrial complex version of being trans. And increasingly we're seeing a global trend of more and more people who have various genders wanting to transition. And by transition, it has become codified as this medical transition thing where access is mediated by Western NGOs. Right? So there's this way that gayness, as Alok set up, is something that is continuously purchased And also, right now, transness is something that is continuously purchased, and we've lost the root of gender and sort of gender liberation as a project of resisting the economic and physical violence that comes along with being read and perceived and policed as a gender non-normative body. And rather, our movement is sort of centering, especially in the case of trans people, middle-class white trans voices, and transition as something that is a product of classism and cissexism, right? Like that a certain kind of body is able to be trans. So when I think about building resistive queer movements and queer bodies, it's about also just complicating the ways that we are already purchasing all of these identities. That the idea of being a beautiful queer body, right? Like beauty is already something that is mediated by the things that we are able to buy and purchase. Right, so I think this is really a project of much more broadly like holding our communities and ourselves accountable to the ways that we perform and perpetuate our identities, and centering not these sort of like individual markers of what modernity is in the way that Israel is doing very explicitly, but continuously centering a project of redistribution and racial and class justice rather than one of sort of mere recognition. And I was going to end there, but then actually Wendy brought up a really interesting point about culture and politics, and I wanted to address that as well. This sort of increasing trend that Israeli culture is something that we can celebrate apart from Israeli politics, and now this sort of LGBT culture is something that we can celebrate apart from LGBT politics. If you are able to view your culture as separate from your politics, it is a product of your race and class position. So when I think about what happened actually last week on our campus, right? Our South Asian cultural organization hosted a mixer with the Israeli Alliance that was marketed as, henna and Israeli dance. Belly dancing. So there's a way that our culture is already being orientalized, and it's being performed in a way that is palatable and accessible to the white gaze. And then there's this way that everyone in this organization was able to view this as a cultural event, without thinking about the ways that, most South Asians in the United States are able to view these things as cultural because we were able to immigrate here as a product of our class caste position. And that what is India to us is not India. So when we, think much more broadly about this distinction between what culture is and what politics is, that's where I think the importance of a BDS strategy and solidarity with the BDS strategy becomes very apparent, because what BDS very explicitly frames for us is says culture and politics are not distinct. Holding Israel accountable to its violent occupation is very much also a cultural strategy, because if we are able to raise the symbolic capital of Israel performing these actions, then that is a way of showing both cultural and economic solidarity with Palestinian people.
Can I just piggyback on
Yeah.
what you said? This notion of capitalism is really important to the project of South African liberation as well, because I think South Africa often gets cited as like an example of what could happen in Palestine, right? Like if we bought. But newsflash, apartheid's not over in South Africa at all. In fact, I would say it's even more pernicious than what it was during apartheid, because at least then you were able to shame white people and point to policy sort of differentials. But now you've been able to see, once again, I've been saying the stabilization of class and racial warfare through a way that's even more pernicious, because it's done through this rhetoric of citizenship and recognition. But what I think one of the keys that we can learn from South African liberation struggle is the narrative that we're taught is that, oh, Nelson Mandela came in, there's this really great black resistance, that only happened because there was loosening in white power. So there's a lot of really great critical race theory scholarship. This guy named Derek Bell, you should check out, who basically argues that black people only advance progress when there's dissent within white people. That the white power structure has to have cracks in order for it to be broken. And what happened in South Africa is because of the economic boycotts and because of the differentials of wealth between white people, that's what allowed the black revolution struggle to happen. So when we're talking about what's happening in Palestine too, this notion of the transnational, I think we are deeply implicated totally. Like, we are complicit in the US government by taking advantage of the rhetoric of the US government citizenship. We are funding Israel. And how can we think about ways to stop funding that? And how do we divide those sources within to allow Palestinian sovereignty and liberation to occur? I think should be key to this.
I think that's all I have to say. Oh, wait, last point on sort of, right, the marriage equality business. Again, sort of this shift from a politics of redistribution to one of recognition that serves to stabilize class warfare. And how, right, this, I don't know, we frequently use the lines that we are reclaiming the color from the rainbow that's stolen from us. Right, that rainbow flags are a way of masking racism and also masking the ways that we could be doing a redistributive politics instead. Like if marriage equality is also implicated in ways that people can, fleece state resources as they use this institution. So thinking about more and more how to center race and class in our analysis, regardless of what movement work we're doing, and continuously questioning what is radical politics. And it's not something that is sort of nuanced and complexified the way that the academy wants it to be so that they can maintain their hegemony, but it is rather something pragmatic and not simple per se, but established from a lot of basic first principles that people have basic rights to have this life with access to water and food and basic humanity, right? So that's a lot of it.